I have many priest friends who, sooner or later in their ministry of priests, discovered that being celibate or single is not their cup of tea. And sooner or later, several of them have left the active Roman Catholic priesthood in order to get married to their sweetheart. And we often talk in person or on the phone with these other bad priests because, birds of a feather stick together. And I discover sometimes that because celibacy is such an important issue close to their hearts, that they are very pro-reform of the church on this one issue. They believe that because it is such an injustice to demand that everyone who wants to be a priest must be single, and so they speak out, voicing a very real and a very valid concern that priests should get married just like anybody else, if they are crazy enough to do so. Then I ask many of them, how about other injustice issues within the church? Now, what do you think and feel about women priests? And of course they will say, oh God, no, that's too much. We have to fight the battle of celibacy, but women priests is too big of a challenge, too big of an issue. Okay. What about marriage equality? What about same-sex marriage? Oh my God, Marek, are you crazy? They say. We have to focus on what is possible to achieve, i.e., married priests. But women priests, or God forbid, lesbian wedding in my church? That's too much. And I often come back from these conversations scratching my head, thinking, how come these good men want to fight their own particular battle, but they are so much unwilling to find other battles equally fighting injustice and oppression? Why is it so easy to focus on one issue that concerns him or her and be absolutely ignorant about other issues that maybe are not so close to his or her heart? And then I remember that we Christians have always been like that. We fight the battles that are closest to our hearts because we experience them personally. The other battles of other people are not so personal. And so sometimes we prefer to keep quiet about these other injustices in our society or in our church. Take Paul, the famous Apostle Paul, a man who did more for the spreading of the gospel than any one of the 12 apostles of Jesus. Some people will say that Paul actually created Christianity as we know it today. And Paul was fighting many battles. Paul was fighting the battles of the gospel. He was convincing us in every single letter of his that he is as much as apostle as Peter or John or others are. He was saying that we all have a call to bear witness to Jesus, not only the 12 ones whom Jesus called in person, that he has the authority to be an apostle, not lesser authority than Peter or Jacob. Well, as you know, Paul never met Jesus in person. Paul was never chosen by Jesus to be his apostle. And that's why when Paul speaks of our call to be disciples and witnesses, he's fighting his battle too, right? You see how he has his own stake in that argument? Paul will focus and fight many other battles, but most of them, they were the battles that touched his life personally. Today, in our second reading to Philemon, we read Paul's words about his relationship to a good friend, Philemon, one of the people he appointed to be his successor, probably in Thessalonica or Colossus. Philemon, like many rich people back then, had many slaves. One of these slaves of Philemon, called Onesimus, escaped from Philemon and ran to Paul, asking Paul to save my back. I want to be with you, Paul. I want to be a disciple of Jesus. I want to be an apostle of Jesus, but I'm also a slave. So Paul, having used Onesimus for a while, today in this reading, decides to send him back to his rightful owner. Paul says, accept your slave back and treat him well, please. Do not punish him too harshly. Treat him as you would treat myself. And one can think, hey, Paul, what's wrong with you? Couldn't you say, free him? Couldn't you say, set this poor man free? Are you blind to this horrendous injustice of slavery? How can you on one hand preach the liberating force of the gospel, and on the other hand send a slave back to his owner? Why is Paul so oblivious to the challenge and injustice of slavery? Why? Because it ain't his battle. It doesn't concern him. Why would he be involved in changing the social system based on slavery if he is a free citizen of Rome? It wasn't something close to his heart. It was something that Paul accepted without any further reflection. Paul probably said to himself, well, we have always had slaves, we always will have slaves. I cannot fight all the battles. Well, he could, and perhaps he should have. As people of faith, sometimes we have to acknowledge that it is okay to be ashamed of some of the people in the Bible. Maybe not all the time, but at times for sure. And today I am ashamed of Paul's silence on this horrendous injustice. I am ashamed that someone who calls himself the apostle of Christ is silent when he has a chance to speak up, to raise the issue of slavery and freedom. Just because it wasn't his battle, it doesn't mean that it wasn't a battle that should be fought. You see, Paul, unlike many other Jews, was a Roman citizen, and with citizenship came many, many privileges. As the only apostle, he could appeal his sentence to higher instance. As the only apostle, he could be appealing for years all the way to the Supreme Tribunal in Rome. He was milking the justice system of the Roman Empire for years. He knew how to play his cards, and he played them well. So why didn't he play the card of slavery? Because it wasn't his battle. Now, his disciple and follower, Luke, who was a freed slave before he met Paul, has a very different outlook on that question of slavery. As you know, slaves were possession to be purchased and sold on the market. So Luke, who was himself a slave before becoming a freed person and eventually disciple of Paul, Luke knew what slavery is all about. Luke knew that one person cannot own, possess another human person. And in today's gospel, Luke makes Jesus address that question. If you remember the gospel reading that Mother Annie just proclaimed, in the last sentence, Luke's Jesus says, "You cannot be my disciples unless you deny all your possessions." Possessions include slaves, because slave is one of your many possessions. You cannot be his disciples unless you deny your right to own, to possess another human person. Because it was such an issue close to Luke's heart, Luke makes Jesus say that. You cannot be my disciple unless you deny your right to possess things and people. At the beginning of the gospel passage, Jesus says something confusing. Luke's Jesus says, "Unless you hate your mother and father, you also cannot be my disciple." And of course, we know it's a parabole. It's an exaggeration. It's not about hating your mother and father, and I know that especially well because they are coming 13 days to visit. It is about putting things in the right perspective and putting people in the right perspective. But also it is about not having anyone or anything more important than the agenda and the mission of Jesus. How about if you replace the word your parents, your wife, your mother, your father, with the word your own agenda? You cannot be my disciple unless you hate your own agenda and follow mine. You cannot be Christ's disciple if you are a one-issue person. If all you talk about is celibacy and priests should get married, but you forget everything else, you're oblivious to all the social and church injustices, you cannot be my disciple. If you are all about social justice, but if you forget that women in the Roman Catholic Church cannot be priests today, if you think that only your battle is important, but the others are not, you cannot be my disciple. Unless you embrace the entire agenda of justice and freedom in Christ, you cannot be his disciple.